I never knew what love was like. Father never showed it to me. Not when I dutifully followed the list of chores he compiled every day for me to complete. Not when I cooked warm, hearty meals for him into the dead of night as sleep ached into my bones. Not even when I came into this world, screaming and covered in amniotic fluid. In that moment, he simply looked up from where he was sitting in front of the hospital bed, took one glance, and gave me a name. Mara, he had stated gruffly. Her name will be Mara. I tried my best to be good to him. After all, he was the only family I had with me. Out in the dense greenery of the forest, we had no aunts, no uncles, no cousins or siblings. He had no wife. I had no mother. I implored him to tell me about mother. So hungry was I for any small amount of information I could learn of the mother I never got to know, of what she was like, what stories she may have whispered to me as she stroked my hair and gently rocked me to sleep, cooing over my slumbering form, what songs she would have sung as she taught me how to cook alongside her in the kitchen, what even her voice would have sounded like. Would it have been breathy and soft, or ever so slightly rough but gentle around those she loved and cared for? Father never told me. Every question regarding mother was met with either silence or harsh refusal. He always tended to look slightly uneased as well, as if the mere mention of her brought feelings of dread, before showing me a way to complete more chores around the house as he sat in his velvet green rocking chair and stared into the warmth of the fireplace. It was a cold Saturday evening as I hurried myself onto the porch of our home. Fall was soon to give way to the unforgiving white of winter, and even with plenty of layers of wool and fur, I could still feel the slight chill of the changing seasons. I began to take off my scarf and opened the front door, entering and stopping with confusion upon hearing the sounds of laughter, both of my father's and a new voice I'd never heard of before. Strange, father never has company over. He loathes the thought of having to entertain guests and prefers his own company rather than that of another. I slowly began to enter the kitchen, and it was there I saw that father was sitting at the table with a strange woman who seemed to glow almost unnaturally upon seeing me. "Mara," he began, "this is Lily." He gestured to the strange woman seated beside him with long black hair and glittering hazel eyes. "Hello, Mara. It's quite nice to finally attach a face to the name. Your father's told me quite a bit about you." She leaned over the table and smiled at me. I hesitantly smiled back before looking to father with nervous eyes. He looked confused as I went over and whispered into his ear if we could talk, but simply nodded and excused himself from Lily, following me to the front porch as we sat down on the steps that laid there. "She's very pleasant, you know. We've been talking for a few months now, and it seems like she won't replace mother." Father looked at me, his eyes flashing briefly with a look of anger. "Don't you dare utter her name on these lands, child," he spat out after a moment. "Why? Because you've never once told me her name or any single thing about her." My voice began to raise. Rage filled my body and tears ran down my face as father took a step forward. "It's for your own good. The woman was wicked, vile beyond your comprehension." "But how do I know that? How can I place trust in your words when you've refused to tell me anything? How can I believe you so blindly?" Trembling, I glanced at father one last time before shaking my head and quickly entering our home once more. I raced upstairs and into my room, slamming the door as I did so and sobbing into my hands as I sunk onto the floor. I could hear father curse loudly and come inside a moment later, apologizing to Lily for the display and offering her the guest room to stay in overnight, as it was already quite dark, and he did not wish for harm to befall her should she venture out so late. Lily thanked him, and I could hear her quiet footsteps as she went up the stairs. She knocked on my door. I calmed my crying and quieted myself. I did not answer. She knocked again, this time more firmly. I still did not answer. Why should I involve myself with her when she may leave us too? Never to be remembered and forced to live as if she never existed in our lives to begin with. Mara, I know you're in there, I signed. I just want you to know, I understand your pain. I once had a daughter a long time ago. I lost her when she was just a baby, sick with a simple cold that had evolved into something much nastier. I cried for days, that turned into weeks, that passed into months. I still can never forgive myself to this day, but just know, I tell you this to share my pain with yours, in hopes that maybe we can heal. Her footsteps echoed softly as she walked away. I took her words to heart. Maybe she wasn't so bad after all, and I had simply overreacted. With the moon being high and the sounds of crickets entering my ears, I changed into my pajamas and quietly laid in my bed, bringing the plush blankets over me and letting sleep overtake me as the world faded to black. I awoke to the sound of screaming, eyes quickly bursting open and body quick to move. I leapt out from the softness of my bed and onto the hardwood floors of my room. I opened the door and looked down both sides of the hallway, trying to figure out where the scream had came from. Another scream echoed, this time from downstairs. I raced downward, skipping steps along the way so I could get to the main source of all this commotion. Words could not describe the horror. Lily was naked, convulsing as she lay on the rug that laid before the fireplace. Her limbs were shaking heavily, and I could see bones cracking and moving underneath the softness of her skin as she moaned in pain. Father stared from his armchair, eyes frozen and mouth agape. He seemed as if he wanted to move, but his fear overtook him and refused to allow that. His fingers were digging heavily into the arms, clawing and beginning to rip tears into the velvet material. I screamed, as still twitching and shaking, Lily stood up before Father. Her skin was beginning to rip and tear off her limbs, and I could see the beginnings of darker skin underneath. She clawed at what didn't come off, and I had to fight the bile rising from my throat as she tore off her old face to reveal a new one, with high cheekbones and fiery red hair. But still, she was not done. She began to giggle as the torn skin that had fallen off began to melt into the hardwood flooring of the living room. Her legs stumbled and she began to slowly make her way towards Father. I could only cry as she plucked out her twinkling hazel eyes, dropping them onto the floor, only for a new, darker green ones to grow in their place, eyes that looked so familiar to my own. What was happening? What horrible sins have we committed for such evils to come into our home? It's so nice to be reunited again, Clarence. Father and I both screamed. I'm surprised that you thought the fires would stop me from coming back. The townspeople are certainly quick to start them. You're not supposed to be here, Eva. I know, but here I am, in the flesh, the new flesh. You were supposed to die in those fucking hellfires, Father roared out. You cannot kill what is not truly dead, Clarence. Besides, a mother's love always fuels her. Father trembled as what I understood to now be Mother stopped in front of him. His voice shook and wavered as he struggled to look into her amused green eyes. You will leave this house and these lands and go back into the land of damnation. You will not stay here any longer. And what if I refuse? Then we will perform the ritual once more and banish you from these lands. But in order to perform it, you would need a sacrifice, a sacrificial lamb to send out and cast away in order to seal away the evils that lie beneath. Along with me, she grinned coyly. You would need to send our daughter. Father began to cry, and Mother only laughed in wicked glee. She stopped suddenly, and it was then I realized her eyes had turned to me. My blood ran cold as she stepped towards me with arms outstretched, body covered in blood and viscera, even though her previous skin had already dissipated. Won't you give Mother a hug? No, you aren't Mother. You can't be. Trembling, I narrowly dodged her arms and quickly retreated behind Father, staring at her in fear of what may come next. I am Mother. Mother, I am. And it would do you well to understand what forces your father has reckoned with, my sweet child. Him and all the other surrounding townspeople who dared to condemn me to a death of blazing fury after I had birthed you so long ago, all because I was not pure. She speaks lies, Mara. Do not heed the sinful cover of such a witch. She only comes to deceive you and I, to take us and use our souls in her pursuit of hedonism. Silence! Mother's voice cracked out, distorted and more raspy than before. I covered my mouth and looked away as slowly stitches began to form around Father's lips, zigzagging back and forth before closing them off completely. He began to get up, but an invisible force held him back down, and he struggled briefly before giving up, eyes gathering tears. I promised you eternity, in sickness and in health. With all my heart, I promised to be by your side, and you crushed me, ripped me apart, and tore the fabric of my being multiple times over before setting the fires that would destroy me. All because I was not pure. All because I was not chaste before we had met. Mother paced in front of Father, back and forth for a moment before settling right in front of him and myself. I gave you my heart, and you did this to me. Now you will give me yours. Screaming. All I could hear, all I could feel, was screaming as I saw Mother claw into Father's chest and rip out his still beating heart. She smirked before taking a vicious, hearty bite and standing back up to look directly into my own matching dark green eyes. Her mouth was gruesome, covered in blood and flesh as she smiled at me. Now, daughter, my sweet Mara, join Mother, and I will show you the bountiful fruits of life and death. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, my grandmother from my father's side took me to a relative's house in the countryside where a family reunion would take place. I remember it being a very elegant yet antique structure with a cobblestone base and tall mahogany walls. To be honest, everything seemed tall at the time because it was indeed taller than me. The house itself was built next to a lake, which was so deep in certain parts that the water looked like a portal to the void, black and seemingly empty. I, who was always excited at the sight of a body of water and the possibilities of being able to play in it, stared deeply at that lake, ignoring the scary-looking water. I immediately started to get ready to go for a swim. I think I was the first one ready, actually. As the rest of my family got ready, I ran towards the lake shore and slowly dipped my foot into the water. To this day, I still remember the way it felt. It contrasts to the ever-hot tropical weather. This lake felt like a tundra. It did not just feel like the cold feeling of a breezy winter night. It was the type of cold that one feels when in a state of absolute terror. The feeling crawled up my legs and up into my spine, and I slowly walked into the lake, water enveloping me. As I walked, I could feel the wet, slimy rocks beneath my feet, threatening to betray my step at any moment. When the water hit me waist deep, their threats became a promise, and I slipped and fell fully into the water. I panicked as water went into my mouth and nose, and quickly opened my eyes under the water to process what had happened. The panic increased as my lungs started to fill with water. I swallowed what seemed to be a gallon of water before I felt a hand grab me and firmly pull me up. My grandmother stared back at me with a mix of fright, shock, and relief at the same time. She scolded me for trying to act grown and not waiting for the adults to accompany me. I coughed up water as she carried me out of the lake and into the house. We went inside a random room that had a bathroom attached, and she sat me down on the tall sink counter, which was situated right in front of the bathroom. Still scolding me, she told me to stay still and left me all by myself. I heard her exit the room and close the door. Tears started pouring from my eyes from the scare of almost drowning, and my even bigger fright of disappointing my grandmother. How unlucky was I to almost drown in waist-deep water and to risk a spanking on top of that. Not very, not in the least. My luck deteriorated even further when the weight of me leaning forward to wipe my tears and rub my eyes made me fall from the counter. Even at that age, I knew I would either die or be seriously injured. Time slowed down to a crawl as I saw the edge of the bathroom get closer and closer. My head was an ache about to get cracked open. I closed my eyes, waiting for the impact. But it never came. The smell of fresh lavender emerged suddenly, like a soft mist. The feeling of soft satin fabric pressing against me felt comforting. The touch of a woman's delicate hands made my eyes open in surprise. Her mocha-colored face was detailed beautifully by wrinkles. Her dark eyes were kind and motherly. She felt cold, but a comfortable kind of cold, like the cool side of a pillow. We stared into each other's eyes for what seemed like a lifetime. I could sense something was wrong with her though. Despite being pressed against her torso, I never felt it rise nor fall. I never felt the heartbeat. Despite our faces being so close together, I never felt the gentle air of her exhale. Now that I think about it, she looked more like a wax figure than a person. The same expression locked on her face even after I said thank you. Slowly, she kneeled and set me down on the floor on my rear, and just as suddenly as she was there, she disappeared. I stayed still on the floor, still looking in the place she was. When my grandmother came back and saw me on the floor, she freaked out. There was no way I would have been able to hop off the counter without injuring myself in some way. With a smile, I explained to her what happened. I told her about the nice lady and how she saved me. I could sense her confusion and watched her purse her lips, getting ready to say something and then pausing. After composing herself a bit, she said, "There is nobody wearing a purple dress in the house." Then I learned the reason why we went to the lake house in the first place. A remembrance ceremony. Among the bouquets of lavender flowers, I saw a picture that made me freeze. It was the lady in the purple dress. She had been dead for 10 years. She drowned in the lake, and her favorite flowers were lavender. They buried her in her favorite purple dress.